4 months since the people of Thailand have been taking to the streets of Bangkok to voice their anger against the monarchy. Months later, their demands remain unmet and the political climate has become rather volatile. Hundreds of people supporting the monarchy staged a counter-protest in central Bangkok. Amid growing tensions, they seemed keen to display their loyalty towards the country's king. For many Thais, any criticism of the monarchy is practically sacrilege. The monarchy is considered the bedrock of their national identity and protected by a law. The rule calls for 3 to 15 years imprisonment for anyone who defames the monarch or members of his immediate family. There are some distinct features of the pro-monarchy demonstrations and anti-monarchy protests. The Royalists' rally had been heavily publicized on social media by supporters of the palace, but the turnout of around 300 people was just a small fraction as compared to the thousands of pro-democracy protesters that have been holding rallies almost daily. The demography was also starkly different. The majority of crowds at the Lumpini Park belong to the older generation compared to the pro-democracy protesters who are mainly university students, young professionals and secondary school students. Police presence in the rallies conducted by the two sides also worthy to take note of. The anti-monarchy protests have always been packed with riot police officials in contrast to the royalist rallies.
It's time we Thai people, we have to go out to protect our king today, because as long as we are Thai people, as long as we live in this land, there always be a king, now and forever.
On the other hand, pro-democracy protesters are seeking international support to gather momentum for their movement. About 5,000 to 10,000 people defied police warnings and marched towards the German embassy in Bangkok to urge a probe against the king, Vajiralongkorn's time in Germany, and if he exercised his powers during that stay. The protesters believe that the king wields an inordinate amount of power in what is largely a democracy, but under a constitutional monarchy. German Foreign Minister responding to the protesters' plea.
Wir prüfen das nicht nur in den letzten Wochen, sondern wir prüfen das auch dauerhaft fort. Und wenn es dort Dinge gibt, die wir als rechtswidrig empfinden, dann wird das sofortige Konsequenzen haben.
Back in July, youth and student-led protests began in Thailand. Since then, the demonstrators have had majorly 3 demands: the resignation of the Prime Minister Prayuth Chan-ocha, who is a former army ruler, a new constitution, and reforms to the monarchy. The scrutiny and public criticism of the monarchy displayed over the last few weeks through those protests is unprecedented. The country's royal institution has been considered the epitome of power. Joining us from Edinburgh is journalist Andrew McGregor-Marshall for more perspectives on this. Hi, Andrew. Thanks very much for speaking with us. Your initial reaction to these counter-protests that we are witnessing, and also the demography of these two sections that have been taking to the streets. We've seen thousands of students, mostly young professionals. On the other hand, these older Thais who believe that any criticism of the monarchy is almost sacrilege.
You're right. It's quite a worrying development, because we've only seen quite a small number of royalist protesters coming onto the streets, as you mentioned in your report. Most of them are quite old. And this is despite the palace and the regime really trying to encourage royalists to come out on the streets wearing yellow to show their support of the monarchy. The turnout has been really low, and the regime has even had to get off-duty police and government officials and others. They brought them into Bangkok in buses and trucks to get them to try and swell the numbers of these royalist counter-protests. So what the regime is trying to do is create the impression of conflict in Thai society. If they can say that there's protests from both sides, and if there's risk of clashes between the opposing groups of protesters, which is looking quite likely because the royalist protesters have been violent in the past, then there's a strong risk we'll see a harsh government crackdown or a coup, And that seems to be where we're heading at the moment.
Protesters have been calling on Germany to probe the king over the extended stays in Bavaria. To what extent do we expect a concrete response from Germany on that front?
Germany is in a very difficult position, and their statements have been quite carefully calibrated. The last thing they want to do is offend the Thai monarchy. But it's very awkward for them to have the Vajiralongkorn living in Germany for most of the year, at a time when he's facing these huge protests at home. He clearly does make political decisions from German soil, which is actually breaking international law. So it does put the Germans in a really difficult position. But we just had some breaking news today. The king had been due to go back to Europe this weekend. He was flying back because he spent most of his time in Germany. But Natalis sources have just told me he's cancelled that trip. He's staying in Thailand for at least until the end of the year. So that's a sign of how sensitive this issue has become.
The Thai opposition has been urging the Prime Minister, even during that debate that was held, to step down. Pressure has only been mounting. Where do you see things heading from this point onwards?
The Prime Minister's position is looking increasingly precarious. But so it's quite possible that as the regime tries to make concessions to protesters to diffuse the situation, we could see the Prime Minister going. But the problem is in Thailand, the Prime Minister isn't the person who has the real power. The real power lies with the monarchy and the military. And if they change the Prime Minister, it's probably likely to be an even more hardline figure who replaces him. So the situation does seem to be escalating towards a confrontation because the monarchy and military show no signs of listening to the calls for reform. The mostly young protesters show no signs of giving up, despite the increasingly harsh crackdowns on them. So we're heading for more possible violence on the streets of Bangkok, unfortunately.
Andrew McGregor, appreciate very much your joining us on the broadcast and sharing those perspectives.